we need to do what humanity's already done incredibly well, which is to develop new knowledge and new technology to solve the really serious challenges which are in front of us.
Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Mark Lynas. Mark is the author of several environmental books, including Seeds of Science, Our Final Warning, and the forthcoming 6 Minutes to Winter. Until 2024, he was the research and climate lead with the Alliance for Science at the Boyce Institute, an affiliate of Cornell University. He is now the policy lead with the pro-science environmental campaign network, We Planet, launched in 2021 and now active in 18 countries. Our conversation starts with a recognition of the dire emergency presented by climate change, and that human food production is a significant contributor to humanity's greenhouse gas emissions. 3 changes can greatly reduce the environmental impact of feeding ourselves. We can reduce or eliminate human consumption of beef and lamb. We can remove the legal and regulatory barriers to genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. And we can remove the legal and regulatory barriers to a new technology known as precision fermentation. Mark believes a brighter future is possible if we allow our policy decisions to be guided by the best scientific knowledge and insight we have available. It's with great pleasure that I bring you my conversation with Mark Lynas. Mark Lynas, thank you for talking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
It's a pleasure, Leslie. Good to be here.
I want to talk to you about something that I think is something that you know a lot about, and something that I think is important for our future, and that's climate change. But not the whole thing, not all of climate change, but one of the major inputs into climate change, and which has been a passion of yours for at least a decade, and that's our food production. And how that contributes to climate change in various factors, in various ways, and what we essentially need to do if we want our global society and civilization to continue past. I don't know. Every time I say this, it seems like our horizon is shrinking. I used to say, in time for our grandchildren, or then in time for our children, but now I'm saying we need to change now. If even people, you and I, who are middle-aged or beyond are going to see the end of our lives without climate catastrophe directly affecting our lives in a major negative way. So let me start with a general question. And we all need to eat. There's 8 billion of us. So we need to make food for all of us if we don't want to starve hundreds of millions or billions of people. But we do harm to the global ecology in our food production. How does humanity feeding itself harm the planet?
Look, this one's really simple, and it comes down to one word, and that one word is meat. And not just any meat, but beef and lamb in particular. So the extensive grazing of ruminant livestock basically takes up about half of the planet's habitable surface, and that's the area which would otherwise be nurturing natural ecosystems and helping sequester carbon and deal with the twin crises we've got of climate and biodiversity loss. So it's really that simple. If we could stop using beef and lamb, but replace these sources of protein, livestock protein, with alternative proteins and largely plant-based diets, then we could, we'd make great strides towards rewilding the the planet, sorry, and reversing the current very dramatic and worrying trends towards biodiversity loss. So, it's something I've campaigned on for a while. I'm not sure that means everyone has to be lentil-eating vegans. I'm not a lentil-eating vegan myself. I love lentils, but I'm not a vegan. But so I'm focused really on the kind of technological shifts that we need to see to replace the livestock proteins that people have become very accustomed to and people love with decent substitutes. And there's plenty of plant-based alternatives now which use modern technologies. The Impossible Burger in the US is a good example. But there's also precision fermentation and all of the interesting genetic work which is going on to basically train microbes to produce the very specific proteins like casein from cheese and things that you need to make acceptable substitutes which are as good as, if not better than, the original. But if we can remove beef and lamb products from the human food supply, we can basically rewild half the earth. And that's, I think, a laudable aim, and one that we've got to keep front and center of our campaigns and our understanding of the food and agriculture issue.
Okay, there is a lot that you said in just those 2 minutes, and I want to dig into a lot of that. But let's start with just beef and lamb. Now, I just want a point of clarification. If we do beef and lamb take up half of the world's surface for agriculture, or is it just feeding ourselves that takes up half of the world's land mass? I wasn't quite when you said it takes up half. Basically, what's the numerator and the denominator on that half?
It's half of the world's terrestrial surface, so habitable land surface.
And is that just beef and lamb, or is that all of human food production? That's the proportion of the the agricultural system, which is livestock. So, the place to check this, by the way, is Our World in Data, and they've got an incredible projection which just shows just how off the charts beef and lamb are as compared to pretty much any other food source. You go down, and even pork, chicken, fish is much lower impact. It's it's down there with legumes and so on. But it's really critical that we understand just the scale of this challenge. And hi everyone, just a quick editorial update here. Mark wanted to let everyone know that the correct figure for land use for livestock is 28% of the Earth's surface, not half. Thanks. And now back to our conversation.
It's because part of this is the greenhouse gas issue as well, because the ruminants are the main producers of biogenic methane. So that's a very potent and important greenhouse gas. But also, it's just because of the huge areas of land that are devoted to livestock ranching, and that's land which could be otherwise hosting natural ecosystems. And it's that scale which is really critical to understand if we're to really begin to address this issue and to the extent that's necessary.
And I guess does that also take into account? I mean, I know that cows eat a lot of grass. They do tremendous amounts of grass and hay, and similar for lamb. So we have to. It's not just the land that they use for the ranching, but it's the land used for the grains or for the stocks that are used to feed the cows and the sheep as well. Is that part of that calculation?
Yeah. Well, yeah. But the absolute worst is the grass-fed. So organic grass-fed beef is about the worst possible ecological impact you can conjure up through our current agricultural system.
Because it's marketed entirely to the environmentally conscious people. That you should if you're going to have meat, it should be organic. If you're going to have beef, it should be grass fed.
Exactly, but that's actually completely backwards. If you want to minimize the land take of beef, you should actually focus it on concentrated animal feeding operations, aka feedlots, aka factory farms, because you can get cattle to marketable weight using half the food and using a tiny amount of the land. The one obvious problem with that, of course, is animal welfare. So to get through that conundrum of the trade-off between animal welfare and extensive livestock ranching, you essentially have to stop using livestock altogether. I mean, that's the only way to really address that. I'm not going to suggest for a second that people focus on buying factory farmed meat products. I mean, the way to get through this is to stop using meat in anything like the quantities that we do now.
All right, so then we're talking about a sociological change, a cultural shift. How do you suggest that we convince people of the need to reduce or eliminate beef and lamb from their diets? Or do you propose a more muscular way of achieving that objective through passing of laws to either restrict, disincentivize, or perhaps even outright ban the farming and or consumption of beef and lamb? Like I understand where you want to get to, and my question is, how would you like to get there? What do you propose to do to achieve that goal?
Well, the first thing to understand is that at the moment we're doing the opposite of banning, which is subsidising. So where I live in the very western edge of England, on the borders with Wales, the main industry, or at least farming industry, is sheep production. So all of our upland areas in Wales are entirely occupied by sheep. In one of our national parks, the Brecon Beacons National Park, there's something like 1 million sheep, which means that the ecology is no more diverse really than your average golf course or bowling green. It's literally just 2 or 3 species of grass. All of the trees are eaten away. There's no forest. There's no ecology to speak of. There's no food web. There's very few insects, very few birds. Certainly nothing of any interest which could constitute a real ecosystem. And actually, the natural ecosystem in this part of the world is temperate Atlantic rainforest. So in some of the very steep-sided valleys where sheep haven't been able to get, you see these amazing assemblages of trees covered in ferns and mosses, and the natural old oak woodlands that would be in this area, which have been entirely clear-cut and entirely destroyed over many centuries, primarily devoted to livestock. And so sheep are the problem, and sheep are what's causing the continued despoilation of our uplands here in England and Wales. And the sheep farmers are kept in business by public subsidy, coming from the government, coming from our taxpayers, which are traded off against schools, hospitals, defence, all the other things that we need to spend public money on. And in return for which we get national parks, which are essentially paper parks, which have no significant protections whatsoever, and are no way distinguished really from any of the surrounding agricultural land, and an opportunity cost, which means that we can't restore our forests or restore peat bogs or any of the kind of carbon sequestering ecosystems which would help, at least to some small extent, tackle climate change as well. So I'm not saying we ban meat, but I'm saying we stop incentivizing meat production with public subsidy as an absolute first point. Secondly, we need to produce better alternatives. At the moment, the Impossible Burger is banned in Europe because of the nonsense GMO hysteria, which I'm sure you'll want to get into as well. But if we forbid the innovative new technologies which we need to substitute for meat proteins, then it's going to be very difficult to make this transition, which we need to do to give people the kinds of substitutes to incentivize them to not eat meat-based products.
Okay, thank you. So let's move. Let's shift from cultural change to technological change. And you mentioned that in your first response, and you just talked about that now. So GMOs are genetically modified organisms, have been a lightning rod for controversy. They are going to save the world, or they are going to ruin the world, depending on whether you are in favor or against them. Tell me a little bit about what GMOs are and explain the controversy to our listeners, and then we can get into the merits of each side.
Yeah, and it might be worth letting people know that I've been on both sides of this issue.
Great. Then you're the perfect person to speak on.
Well, kind of, assuming you can trust me to try and explain it honestly and represent both sides fairly, which I've tried to do. And I wrote a book about this called Seeds of Science back in, I think it was published in 2018, because I wanted to tell this whole story. It's actually the closest thing I have to an autobiography, because I started off as an environmental activist, and one of the most successful campaigns I was involved in was against genetic engineering, or the very early days of the so-called GMOs. And we used to go out in the dead of night and destroy scientific experiments, and we basically trashed all of the GM field trials which were being undertaken across the UK at that time. This was in the late 1990s, mid to late 1990s.
So what motivated you? I mean, that's vandalism,
yeah,
right? That's destruction of knowledge, and even before we get into what your goals are, sabotaging scientific experiments is something that, in principle, I'm generally against. Like I'm pro knowledge, pro learning, even if it's on subjects that I'm uncomfortable about. And so the bar for me to support such an action would be very high. But you were clearly dedicated to that cause to the point where you did those things. Why were you so dead set against even experimentation and learning about what the potential for genetic modified organisms could provide?
It was a sort of a philosophical objection, which had some specific components to it. I think we were against the idea that humanity could play God by genetically engineering the biology of species, whether they were plants or animals, and creating new types of organism. That this would be opening the door to all sorts of horrific, weird monsters. And actually, if you look at the imagery of the time, and you still see some of this on the internet, you get like a half fish, half strawberry, and things like that, just kind of to emphasize that sort of yuck factor that people instinctively feel. So I think there was elements of that. There was also the specific issue of a company called Monsanto, which no longer exists. It's been taken over by Bayer, which is a German company. But that led the GMO revolution with a particular product, which was the Roundup Ready soybean, and later Roundup Ready corn and cotton, which was so these were crops which were expressly designed to be resistant to Monsanto's proprietary herbicide, Roundup, or otherwise known as glyphosate. And so the images that we have were of these sort of sterile monocropped fields drenched with glyphosate because of the genetic engineering. So while we saw the technology as risky, we felt that it was being deployed in a way which was making all of the problems of farming monoculture worse. So why take the risk in the interest of simply helping this monopolistic American corporation sell more of its chemical pesticide? That was like basically the centerpiece of the campaign. But it wasn't really just about Monsanto. It was about the entire technology. I mean, we even at one point went out in the night to the Roslin Institute near Edinburgh and tried to steal Dolly the sheep. So, we were against cloning too, and we were against the whole sort of use of, I'm not sure how far we even understood genomics or genetic engineering or whatever, but we were against, we were kind of Luddites. I think there was a kind of a proud identification, even with the historical Luddites, and saying that we wanted to kind of go back to the land and use things in a more traditional, natural sort of way. So, there's a lot of what the environmental movement stands for in that, the sort of anti-industrialism, almost anti-enlightenment, really. It's actually quite an anti-science mindset, as you might expect, because we're trashing scientific experiments and preventing the generation of and use of scientific knowledge, because we felt this was knowledge that shouldn't be there. And of course, that's something that goes back to the book of Genesis. It's there in so many different cultures, that knowledge is power, an understanding that knowledge is power, and a feeling that there's certain types of knowledge that we shouldn't develop and we shouldn't possess. So a lot to get into there.
Yeah, and one of the things that you mentioned, one of the objections that you had, this idea of playing God, it seems that every time there's a new capability that we have uncovered, some form of that argument, humanity is like, we are not ready as a species, as a society, as individuals to wield this much power, and that it's not meant for us. It always seems to be an objection that's raised, and yet, most of the time it's incorporated, and then 10 years or 20 years later it becomes part of the infrastructure, and people don't think about it. And I guess it's trivial to observe that doomsday has not arrived yet, although maybe tomorrow, maybe the next one will be the species killer. But you had quite the, almost, if I can describe it that way, the way you described yourself sounds to me like you were quite extreme in your views. You were quite dedicated, but it was like on a spectrum of eco beliefs. You were, I'm not, almost fringe, and now you've changed. So can you tell us about what your current views are, and how what happened that got you to change your mind?
Yeah, and well, I'll try and give you the kind of short version in the interest of time. But it was because this is quite a complicated issue and quite nuanced that I wrote a whole book about it, because I wanted to give a full answer to that question. Because it's, for me, and I think for the environmental movement and for issues of science and technological power and things, these are really critical issues which we were thinking through and we were tackling. And I came to change my mind on this completely, and I've spent the last decade and a half trying to reverse some of the damage and trying to support scientists to to have more social license, to be better communicators, and to be able to progress the frontiers of knowledge on genetics, as in other areas, in ways which can benefit both humanity and hopefully also the natural world, and enable us to tackle some of these really big challenges that you discussed earlier. But to come back to the question of the kind of Damascene conversion, which is what always interests people, I think I'm a kind of a special case. It wasn't like I went to a talk and somebody changed my mind. What happened really was that I was also working on different issues, and climate change in particular, which I started writing books on and started doing field research on back in 2000. So, a quarter of a century ago, when this wasn't the huge issue that it is now. And I set about trying to demonstrate that climate change was real. And I went to island nations to see sea level rise, and I went to see melting glaciers in the Peruvian Andes, and I went to Alaska to see the permafrost disappearing. And I went all around the world, but I also realized that what I could see and what anecdotes I could pick up weren't the same as scientific knowledge. That cliche about data not being the plural of anecdote. I understood that fairly early on. So I was reading scientific journals and looking at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is this big scientific cooperative exercise, and trying to make sure that I had the evidence to support the claims I was making, and that evidence was scientific and was produced in rigorous ways using peer review and all of this kind of stuff. And so when I was debating climate skeptics, of whom there were many at the time, I would say, look, this is what the scientific consensus is. And I know the scientific consensus is this because the collaborative bodies like the IPCC and, the Royal Society and the American Academy of Advancement of Science and whoever put out statements saying that this is the current state of the science on climate change. And that's what we should take as a first principle in terms of what our understanding of the issue is. And the problem came actually when I was asked one day by The Guardian to write my kind of stock anti-GMO piece. I can't remember what the specific issue was, but by this stage, as a science writer, as somebody who thought themselves as a science writer, I thought, well, I better, make sure that I've got some references in this. And, when I wrote about how bad GM crops were, I tried to find the evidence, and other than stuff that was produced by campaign groups like ones I've been involved with, it wasn't there. The scientific community wasn't producing anti-GM stuff. It was the activist community that was doing it, and which then, activists were referring to other activist material, which, for someone who was trying to communicate science wasn't good enough, right? Mm-hmm. And I had this kind of horrible feeling. I was like literally thinking, oh, shit, I might have got this issue wrong. And so, I wrote the piece anyway, but I knew, the cat was sort of out of the bag by that point. And I as I looked into it more, I fairly quickly figured out that I and my colleagues have done science an enormous disservice, and that I couldn't square, arguing that climate change was real because science was telling us so, and also simultaneously arguing that GM crops were bad, even though science was saying the precise opposite. So that was what happened essentially, and I, then worked with scientists at Rothamsted Research in the UK and even across Africa with the Open Forum for Agricultural Biotechnology in Africa. I visited trial sites in Africa where specific corn crops are being developed to resist insect infestations and to be more drought tolerant, which could help improve food security in sub-Saharan Africa and stuff like that. So I discovered more and more actually about how this technology could be incredibly useful for humanitarian purposes, and also to reduce the use of agrochemicals, which was something I still believe and had always believed was an important thing to do. Because insect-resistant crops don't need to be sprayed with so much insecticide. It's really that simple. And I saw that in operation in Bangladesh and the Philippines and elsewhere. There was a whole issue of golden rice as well. When that got trashed by activists, the golden rice plots, and this is a vitamin A rice, which could help tackle, there's hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood blindness and deaths that result from vitamin A deficiency in developing countries. Golden rice was developed to try and at least partly help address this, and yet it was being trashed by anti-GM activists who'd kind of been my former colleagues in arms, if you like. So I wrote about this, and I campaigned quite loudly for the environmental community to actually support golden rice, because I thought it was so critical that we weren't doing something which could have such a drastically negative humanitarian outcome.
All right, so let me take the other side, a bit of your former self, and I want you to address some of the arguments that people make against GMOs. I've only got one that can be perhaps about the science, but the rest are more practical. But let me start with the first one, and that is that when we're dealing with our understanding of genetics and the relationship between the actual genetic code and what results from it, we've got some understanding, but it's still pretty basic. We're still awed at the inherent complexity of the genetic code. And whereas, sure, if we can do some selective breeding and get different results, larger fruit, faster gestation, and that has a genetic consequence, there's a difference in principle between selective breeding and directly manipulating the genetic code, and the chances of bad negative effects, the bad side effects that we did not foresee being part of our food stream, is much higher with GMOs than with other means. So how does the science address this concern that I guess this is kind of giving us the power of God, or we're not ready for this, but that our knowledge is not yet ready on a risk based on a weighted risk basis, that for something so crucial to our continued existence, we need to wait until our understanding is better before we start directly manipulating the genome for certain desirable effects.
Yeah, that was an objection which was often heard, but fortunately that's amenable to scientific research. I mean, that's a question you can literally answer. You can both characterize the genome after the genetic engineering and look at the phenotype, so actually look at the chemistry and the biology of the resulting organism and see whether there's anything in there that you don't want, see whether there's a novel allergen or some kind of novel toxin. So all of the GM crops which have gone to market have undergone vast amounts of safety testing to answer that question. And apart from some rather dodgy studies which have claimed the opposite, basically the entire body of published science on this shows that there's no difference in so-called genetic engineering to any other ways of altering the genome of a crop, whether that's so-called selective breeding or conventional approaches, or indeed mutagenesis. And it's worth spending a moment on that, because previous to genetic engineering, which is a very precise alteration of the genome where you're taking a specific genetic sequence that you want and you're inserting it into the DNA of the target organism, mutagenesis was basically just blasting apart the genome with radiation or chemicals and causing DNA breaks, and those would repair, and you'd get one time out of 10,000 you'd get something interesting. Like I think ruby red grapefruit was developed that way, and various types of barley that were used in beer production. So quite a lot of food was done that way, and that was never subject to any great hoo-ha or hysteria like GMOs were, even though it's far less precise. And the argument really is just that, well, we've already been doing it for a bit, right? Basically, not that it's any more natural or anything like that. It was just like kind of grandfathered into the food system. And of course, with new genomic techniques like CRISPR-Cas and other specific sequence-based approaches to genetic engineering, you can do some very, very targeted changes to the genome of a crop where you pretty much fully understand it, and yet those are still subject to the kind of anti-GMO hysteria, which is why it's still not permitted in the European Union. It's really kind of extraordinary that a whole branch of science is basically functionally banned in Europe because of anti-science hysteria, which has been promoted by the environmental movement, including yours truly, for the last, now going on 30 years, which is highly unfortunate, and it's really time for that to change.
All right, so that's the scientific or philosophical objection, but let's deal with something practical, and it's the Monsanto objection, or the Bayer objection, as they're now called. They were bought out, and in principle, GMOs could be used for all these sorts of things, but in practice, we have vast monocultures of Roundup Ready soybeans that's made by Monsanto, now Bayer, and they are just to quote you, drenched in pesticides because it doesn't affect the plant. This is two problems. One is vast monocultures are bad for the environment. That's a more general problem than just GMOs, but GMOs in this case are exacerbating it, as well as it's increasing, not decreasing, the amount of pesticides being used, which is bad both from a pollution perspective and because that is selectively favoring insecticide-resistant bugs that will eventually come by, and like we're creating an arms race with nature, and you don't tend to win those in the long run. So from a practical perspective, whatever the potential for GMOs might be, in practice, it's leading to an exacerbation of monocultures and an increase in pesticide use. So people might be against them in practice, even if not necessarily in principle. What would you say? What would you say to that argument?
Yeah, I think that was a reasonable objection to the first generation of GM crops, to Roundup Ready in particular. But it's not a reasonable objection to golden rice. It's not a reasonable objection to insect-resistant eggplant in Bangladesh. It's not a reasonable objection to...
Are these out in... I'm asking because I don't know the answer.
Right.
Are these in trials, or are these being grown in quantities and feeding populations of people around the world?
Where they can get past activist campaigns of demonization, whether it's through court cases or through trashing them in the fields, they are out. Golden rice was blocked by Greenpeace and other campaign groups in the Supreme Court in the Philippines, and the scientific community there is busy trying to get it unblocked. So that's been a problem, and that's really held up that whole program. The insect-resistant eggplant was released in Bangladesh and was grown by tens of thousands of farmers, and that meant that there was a dramatic reduction in the amount of insecticide that they had to spray on their crop, which reduces the numbers of poisoning of humans and reduces the obviously the negative impacts of pesticides on the local environment. So the thing is, these arguments don't make any sense if you lump together the whole genetic engineering, like the trait might be good, the trait might be bad, and so the fact that the environmental movement as was opposed the totality of genetic engineering, that showed really that this was an anti-science, and because they were not prepared to consider its benefits, pros and cons on a case-by-case basis, which after all really in the scientific sense is the only reasonable approach.
Okay, and I guess this is a hybrid of scientific and practical. Can we trust that the data that is an input into the scientific consensus isn't being manipulated either subtly or dramatically? There's no shortage, unfortunately, of bad behavior. Tobacco companies, for example, minimized and disparaged studies that showed that smoking cigarettes was harmful to your health. They created their own studies that were heavily biased, that came to a different conclusion, or at least that it was indeterminate. We've seen some pharmaceutical companies sort of skew studies that they funded and designed to minimize the side effects of some of their drugs, or to exaggerate the
or vaccines
efficacy.
Vaccines maybe. The case you're making there is exactly the one that's made by anti-vaccine activists about how 100%. That's been fully weaponized into the Trump administration.
I would like to know whether asking questions about the source data on which the scientific conclusions are granted is an appropriate use of skeptical inquiry, or veering into conspiracy, tinfoil hat conspiracy data of when it comes to GMOs.
I think, well, it's like any field of science. It's both. Scientific studies need to be open, and they need to be replicable, and they need to be free from conflict of interest, both to be believable and to be valid. So having companies sponsoring their research, which mysteriously always comes out with a result which is in support of the company, that's not a legitimate use of science. And there's a real crisis, I think, in science of reproducibility, and with the increasing corporatization of science, because there's a reduction of money in the in the public sector now to be able to do this kind of research and development. So I think that is a critical issue, but it's become weaponized by conspiracy theorists. And as I mentioned earlier, the anti-vaccine movement has flourished around these kinds of conspiracist memes, that the pharmaceutical industry is complicit in covering up illness, that illness is better solved by natural means, like getting measles and gaining your natural immunity. And we saw the same, of course, during the COVID pandemic as well. So it's important, I think, to make sure you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater on this. Science is still the only way that humanity has to understand at a sort of empirical level the reality of the world around us. But it has to be, as I say, it has to be rigorous, it has to be reproducible, and it has to be free from conflict of interest to be fully believable. But if it passes these tests, then it's the absolute best tool that we've got and ever invented, and probably ever will invent.
Okay. Last question that I have for you on this particular topic, and that is, one of the things that drove me nuts about global policy regarding the various COVID vaccines is that they were developed either by government bodies or government arm's length organizations, or massively subsidized and funded by government bodies, which is fine. My objection is, after governments of the world, primarily in Britain and China and the United States of America, came up with these vaccines, we then funded their discovery. We then gave patents to companies, so they had the exclusive right to manufacture them, which at least at first led to several months, nearly a year, where there was a shortage of global vaccines. Whereas if it was opened up and there wasn't the exclusive right granted through patents to these companies, that we could have had more vaccines sooner. My question related to GMOs, like when we're talking about the vitamin A enhanced rice, when we're talking about insect resistant eggplants and other crops, are these patented by corporations? Are they kind of open so that if you pay a license fee, anybody can use them? Like what's the nature of how these non-Roundup Ready, non-Bayer owned GMOs are used, and how available are they to the people that need them most?
That's a great question, and ironically enough, the first generation, and patents don't last forever. I mean, they have a lifetime, right? And so the first generation of Roundup Ready is now off patent because it's expired. So you can go and grow the Roundup Ready soybeans for free, and you don't have to pay Monsanto or Bayer a penny. And the patent system is there to protect, or at least to incentivize the development of novel technologies, right? Because then you get to have a monopoly of the intellectual property of your own invention for a period of time, in exchange for you making public how this invention was developed. And then, of course, you can license it, and the same goes for literally all technologies, including the software that we're, and the hardware that we're currently talking on, and CRISPR, and literally everything that defines the modern world around us is all patent protected. My own books are copyright protected because I don't want people to just freely share them, otherwise I'd never get the money back that I spent, over the years of writing and researching and so on. So there's a reason why intellectual property protection exists. What I think is wrong is when the intellectual property is not something which the corporation itself has developed. So, like with seeds, these have been developed by farmers over generations. The specific genetic sequence in the soybean that protects against glyphosate may have been inserted by Monsanto, but that the whole rest of the seed is common property of humanity, and generations of farmers, in my view. So I'm quite skeptical, actually, of the very broad interpretation of patents, so-called patents on life. And I think that seed breeders' rights need to be much more protected than is the case at the moment, and that should take precedence. At least, however, the GMO crops that we're referring to, like golden rice, is not patent protected, so it's licensed for humanitarian use across the board. The same goes for the eggplant in Bangladesh. So yes, the technology is patented, but it's allowed free for use for farmers, and farmers can save the seed and share them and everything else. So in some ways, that issue is at least addressed for most of these humanitarian efforts. Otherwise, it wouldn't work, right? Because these are farmers in poorer countries who, obviously can't afford to pay an additional premium for intellectual property rights.
All right, thank you. Again, in your initial response, you brought up something that I only heard of when I looked at the Reboot Food website, and that was it. And you mentioned precision fermentation. Now, I know what fermentation is, right? That's the process by which you pickle foods or even yeast to raise bread. It's how we make beer, wine, spirits. But that's not what you're talking about when you talk about precision fermentation. Can you tell us what precision fermentation is, please?
It's literally using microbes to do what. So, microbes to do what organisms do. Microorganisms do what macroorganisms do currently. So instead of having a cow to produce certain proteins, whether they're in milk or in beef, you can get microorganisms, bacteria or yeast or other single unicellular organisms to produce this in a confined environment, essentially. So that it's a bit like brewing beer, except that it's not yeast producing consuming sugars and producing alcohol that you want. It's consuming some other feedstock and producing particular proteins or lipids, fats, which can be then used in human food supply or whatever. So precision fermentation it's not particularly novel. That's what produces a large proportion of the pharmaceutical products that we already use. things which would otherwise have been developed, from, well, I mean, a good example is maybe insulin. That's used to be produced from like boiling down the pancreases of millions of pigs, and it's now produced by, I think, largely by yeast in big vats, and that's what's enabled insulin to be cheap enough to, fortunately, keep diabetes at a relatively controllable level. So that's one example, but there's many more. And if precision fermentation is allowed to really take off, then we can produce pretty much all of the fats and proteins that we need in human food, which currently come from livestock, in confined environments from microorganisms, using tiny amounts of land and much less other inputs, whether it's feedstocks or and having or energy, and having a much dramatically reduced impact on the environment as a result.
All right, so tell me a little bit more about that. So I can understand this might be something that's good for fairly straightforward substances. So insulin is a single chemical, right? And so we've got microbes that can make that. But if we're talking about food, foods have fats, lipids, proteins, all sorts of things in there. They don't just exist together; they're connected in very complex ways. So it's great that we have the technology to create these things on an individual basis. Are we able to stitch them together, or are they just inputs to other processes at this point? I'm trying to understand the current state of the technology. What are we capable of doing today, and what are we working on for tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And the other side of this is probably cultured meat. So, that's then bringing together all the different types of proteins in a particular matrix, involving lipids and collagen and all the kinds of things that you need to give the resulting product a kind of mouthfeel and, all of the different attributes that you get from real meat, right? Because you're just allowing cellular proliferation so that you can actually grow out a piece of meat which looks as much like the original as possible, but is done without raising and slaughtering an animal. So that's how you produce, and there are cultured meat products already becoming available, chicken and fish, and I think there's one going into pet food actually now as well. And again, I think that could be really useful to produce, very high-end stuff initially, like bluefin tuna and sushi. If you can grow that in cultured meat, then you don't have to take these incredibly rare and precious species out of the wild ocean. But in terms of precision fermentation, yes, it's largely going to be for single fats and single proteins, which can then be combined into different products. But if you want to make vegan cheese, then you've got to be able to culture the protein ingredients, casein and whey and other things like that, which go into making cheese. Because if you don't have the right inputs, you're going to be using, a lot of the vegan cheeses now aren't that nice because they're using coconut and various plant originated things, which they're just not. Then they might look like it, but they don't really taste like it, and there's certainly no real substitute, and probably not much healthier. So but theoretically, we could generate through precision fermentation all of the lipids and proteins that we would miss from using much less livestock.
All right, so there's a let's focus on that then. Why would we want to use precision fermentation for these inputs rather than just getting the milk directly from livestock? What makes this high tech solution or opportunity superior in your view to just doing what humanity has done to get these proteins and lipids for tens of thousands of years?
Because the vast majority of animal biomass that's currently on the planet, apart from humans, is our livestock. We've decimated all of the wildlife that used to exist on this planet with us and replaced it with pigs, chickens, and beef and lamb. So we can't have a planet which has a thriving biodiversity if we don't deal with the livestock issue. And that means that we've got to find ways to develop alternative proteins, whether it's plant-based, precision fermentation, cultured meat, or whatever. But both the land use and the greenhouse gas implications of not tackling livestock means that we would be heading towards a drastically depleted planetary environment. So, we've got no choice other than to tackle this issue. And I know it's tough for people. I know it's tough for farmers, and it's going to be a long and difficult transition. But just as we've moved away from coal and moving away from oil and gas, we'll need to do the same with livestock to really get a grasp on what we need for full planetary sustainability.
All right, and how long do you think it will be, or like where are we now? Are we able to, in terms of actually having these techniques, cultured meat and precision fermentation, to replace livestock? Like, if we were to decide that we wanted to go with that, are we able to replace livestock at this point? Is that on the horizon? Is it a distant future? I'm trying to understand what the current state of our capabilities are in this area.
Well, the first thing we have to do is not ban it. At the moment, it's effectively...
Why? Okay, so why is it currently banned? And if so, what's...
Yeah, I mean,
for those that want to, what's the rationale?
Italy has banned cultured meat. Florida's banned cultured meat. Hungary, Austria. So loads of countries now, under pressure from the meat lobbies, have banned cultured meat. And they're doing exactly what the anti-GMO movement did in the 1990s and 2000s, which is to ban an entire emerging field of human scientific understanding and knowledge, which could improve outcomes for all of us. So we've got to not allow this kind of knee-jerk. Well, it's not just kind of ignorance. It's actually to do with vested interests, which are worth billions. Right. So on this issue,
if I represent the meatpacking industry, of course I'm going to say cultured meat is terrible. It's not dignified. Yes. It's the worst thing ever. But that's just me talking my book. I've got a vested interest as representing the meat industry.
Yeah, so we've got to not let the vested interest block these technologies from even being developed, and there's no incentive to develop it if you're banned from ever going to market, and that's pretty much the situation in the European Union at the moment, where alternative proteins, which are produced using novel microbes, there's not really a pathway to market because the regulations just looks like it's just going to be too onerous, and so you can't get funding into startups, you can't get the kind of financial support you need to develop these technologies. So that we've got to remove the blocks, really, and then I'll be able to answer your question about how quickly this food revolution can take place. But I think it's quite quickly. The science is there, the technologies are ready to go. We've just got to take the brakes off and allow scientists and technologists to do what they're best at, which is to do amazing new innovative things.
All right, so let's bring this all together, and thank you for all of your insights. I think you and I share a perspective that our planet faces a real pending crisis with the climate, among many other things, but certainly with the climate. How much of the climate issue is a result of food? You did say it was a huge aspect, but there's energy production, there's transportation, there's a lot of other things, industry that goes into climate change as well. How much of our greenhouse gas emissions are due to our food production?
This is a contested issue. I would say it's about 15%. So it's not that different from electricity or something. Or actually not. It's about the same as transport, I think, food production. So, we have to deal with, and I say it's largely meat. We have to deal with meat just as we have to deal with electrifying cars and removing oil from surface transport and indeed aviation and so on. But yes, it's a really significant slice, and we can't ignore it and really effectively get to net zero or tackle climate change at any meaningful level.
All right, and if we were to follow your advice here, and basically our conversation has focused on three main areas, and that is reducing ideally to zero our consumption of beef and lamb, embracing or at least removing the regulatory and legal barriers to having genetic modified organisms, genetically enhanced plants and crops into broad circulation, and using precision fermentation to replace a lot of what not just meat, but all the other aspects of animal husbandry. How much of that can we realize? What's the benefit if we actually embrace these three ideas that you've proposed today?
Well, the benefits are that we could rewild a substantial proportion of the land's surface and bring back species which are currently excluded because their habitats destroyed by farming, livestock ranching in particular. Allow the rainforest to regrow, allow the grasslands to return, the wetlands and the rivers to become natural, and all of these species to begin to repopulate some of the areas that we've excluded them from. And these renewed, rewilded ecosystems to sequester large amounts of carbon, and for these livestock also to stop producing, because they're not existing anymore, the biogenic methane, which is a substantial cause of the rapid warming, accelerated warming that we're currently seeing. And at the same time, we'd have a healthier human population. I mean, a lot of the modern diseases are associated in various complicated ways with our diets and animal product heavy diets in particular. So a much more mixed, a much more plant-based diet is undoubtedly going to be healthier for everyone, which is going to reduce the amount we have to spend in hospitals and increase the lifetimes and the happiness and the flourishing generally of humans alongside our restored, rewilded ecosystem. So for me, that's a future which is worth fighting for, and it's only going to be delivered if we allow scientists to do their jobs and stop demonizing science. And personally, I've learned from a lifetime's experience how important that effort is.
Yeah, every disaster movie starts with a main character ignoring the advice of a scientist. I'm definitely in the pro-science camp. Mark Lynas, this has been illuminating. I've learned a lot. Thank you for answering so many of my questions. Any last thoughts you would like to impart on our listeners today?
Well, I just think it's really important to think about how the future can be better than because I'm not sure how to put this, but I've having written about climate change, I'm currently doing publishing a book on nuclear war. We get I spend a lot of time thinking about the doom scenarios, Armageddon, the apocalypse. But actually, if we allow science to proceed and we empower and we celebrate science, I think we can have a dramatically better future where we can completely deal with these problems which seem so insuperable and so impossible. And science and technology is probably the main way that we're going to do it, because it's the main way that we've dealt with challenges in the past, whether it's communicable diseases or famine or anything like that. So, we need to do what humanity's already done incredibly well, which is to develop new knowledge and new technology to solve the really serious challenges which are in front of us. All
right. I couldn't have said it better myself. Mark Lynas, again, thank you for speaking with me today.
Thanks, Leslie. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review and showing your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, on Facebook, and you can follow us on Blue Sky at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblatt. See you next time.